In our last tutorial, we had one pattern and then a second pattern. We numbered both of them and we cut out one copy and we placed those pieces back on the second pattern. I have these 5 pieces of glass here that I'm going to be using. This one's black opalescent. This is lime green cathedral because you can see through it and it's one color. This one is called opalescent. It's green opalescent. You can only see the light through it. You can't really see what's on the other side. It's translucent. We have specific names for these pieces of glass, and I may choose some different ones depending on how well the cutting goes on these. Right now, what I'm going to be doing is labeling all of those cut pattern pieces, those paper pieces, so that I can sort them and place them on the pieces of glass that I'm going to cut them out of. So right now, what I'm going to do is give each one of these a name. Like I said, in class, we have specific names. So for this black opalescent, in class, we call it solid black opalescent. But for your purposes, you can just say B for black. I'm just taking those tree trunk pieces and marking them with a B for black. Now I'm going to use lime green cathedral. We call it LGC in class, but you can just say green or light green or lime green. On all those pieces that I want to be that color, I'm going to put these as the labels. So I'm color coding right now. With whatever remaining pieces that you have, you can continue to label all of the pieces on your pattern, just like I'm doing right here, G for green. And like I said, in class, we'd be a little bit more specific about those colors because we have lots of greens and lots of blues. But now I've got the rest of the background that I want to choose the glass for. I've chosen N for navy, this darker color, and then this sky blue opalescent for the upper parts. You can do this however you would like. This is your choice, but you continue to color code so that you can sort your pieces and place them on your chosen colors of glass. Now you can pick up the pieces and lay them out on each piece of glass that they go on. You want to do this as soon as possible, especially if you're in class, because it reduces the amount of time that your pieces remain loose, because you want to glue them onto your glass normally. But we're going to do something different. If we don't have glue, then we're going to be using a Sharpie to trace them onto the pieces of glass. Now, since this is a landscape, you're going to notice that we have a lot of horizontal lines. Well, so does the glass. The glass has what's called a grain, and it's the way it gets poured into the glass rollers. And you'll see that it forms a horizontal line going across. You might want to pay attention to that when you put your pieces on your glass to cut them, so that you don't wind up with a sky that's vertical. That can look really weird, and you won't notice it until the very end. So when we put our pieces on here to trace, we're going to pay attention to the way we lay them out on the glass so that when it's done, you have a horizontal sky, and it goes with the grain. On this kind of glass, it doesn't really matter so much the way you lay them out. In class, what we usually do is use rubber cement to glue them to the glass before we start cutting them out. Again, we are going to be using a Sharpie to outline all of these pieces. The Sharpie comes off when you use the grinder, so that's why in class we don't use this Sharpie method. Before we place these pieces on to trace them, you want to make sure that you're using the glass as efficiently as you can. You don't want to waste glass. A lot of times you have to recut pieces, so you don't want to just place it right here and then waste all this glass here. Place them so that you have a little extra glass in case something goes wrong. Also, if you happen to have edge pieces or pieces that fall on corners, you can certainly place them right in corners, just like these, so that you can cut and you won't have to worry about those edges because, they're already corners and they're already straight. So you can use the rest of this glass here if you happen to break a piece the first time you cut it. Now, holding the pieces in place, I'm just going to take the Sharpie and trace very carefully around the entire piece. So my Sharpie is tracing the edge, and then when I take the piece away, I immediately number it the way the pattern piece had that number. Here it makes more sense for me to turn that piece around so that I have a straight edge. So again, very slowly, very carefully tracing all around, and it doesn't really matter if you're getting Sharpie on your pattern pieces, because you just want to trace it nicely, because this is what you're going to go by for cutting your pieces. And then don't forget that you have to number it the way you wrote it. So turn the piece around and number it the way it was written on the pattern piece. As soon as you're done tracing them, set them aside, because you don't know. Maybe you might have to use them again to recut. So better hang on to them and put them in a different pile. Now for the rest of all of your pieces, you're going to continue to arrange your pieces in whatever way you can so that you can maximize how much glass you're using. So I always fuss over a little bit about the way I'm going to arrange the pieces in order to trace them, so that I will have roads going all the way through. You have to be able to split your glass into separate islands so that you can cut all of these pieces. You have to separate them first. So make sure that you have pathways that your glass cutter can go through so that you can cut them apart. I just continue to trace very carefully. Hold them with one hand, trace around with the other, transfer the number the way you wrote it on the pattern piece. I'm going to continue doing this. If you'd like to fast forward through this part, you may. One little trick, anytime I have any kind of curves, if you've noticed the way I've placed these pieces so that these curves that I'm doing right now are placed right at the corner so that I sort of cut the corner off, that's a very, very good strategy to have. And you'll see when I get to cutting how I do this. Same with when you have a curve like this piece right here. Notice that I'm placing the points on an edge and I'm tracing along like this. So this curve right here and this curve, these are curves that I'm going to cut first before I cut anything else. The curves are always the hardest cuts to make on any pattern pieces. So when you place them just like this on the glass and make them the first cut that you make on those pattern pieces, you're going to be more successful. That's why I have them placed this way. Only with more experience in cutting pattern pieces do you really figure this out. But it took me years to figure it out this way. Now notice too, I'm using black Sharpie on black glass. And you may think, oh, it disappears. You can't see it. But look, if I bounce some light on the glass, you're going to see that Sharpie shows up. So it is okay to use Sharpie, black Sharpie, on dark glass or black glass. Some people, though, still don't like it and they prefer to use paint pen. That's okay too. But I'm just trying to tell you that it's totally okay to use black Sharpie on black glass. So the way I'm going to be cutting these out is I'm going to be lining up my glass cutter so that I'm going right along the inside part of the Sharpie. going from one edge of the glass to another. So you'll see where the score line is, and you can use the back side of your cutter to tap it, and then the piece will come apart. Now I'm going to take the glass cutter, going from one edge to another, to separate the usable glass from my glass pattern pieces. So straight cut, going from one edge to another, break with my hands. Thumbs on top, hands into fists with thumbs on top like that, and bend backward. Now I'm going to go from one edge to another, again on the inside of the Sharpie line, just cutting this entire edge of this pattern piece. Nice and slow, one edge to the other. Thumbs on top, knuckles underneath on either side of the score line, snap back. Very simple, very easy. Sometimes your knuckles will collide underneath. That helps you to avoid injury in the future. Now I'm going to cut the rest of these sides. Again, this side and this side need to be cut separately. Cut right on the inside of the Sharpie line from one edge to the other. On this cut, I can break it with my hands, but on all the rest of these cuts here, there's not a whole lot of glass for me to hold on to. This is where pliers come in. So I've got it thumb on one side, and then I have my pliers, the flat jaw on the top, the same side that my thumb is on when I'm holding it, just like this. Make sure that you position it so it's on the other side of where your thumb is, and then snap it backward. It's really important to grip your glass as close to the score line with your hand and place the pliers right opposite. It's going to be really important, because there's so little glass to hold on to, that you use pliers, and you make sure that you use them correctly. Always make sure that you are just using them to grip your glass. Not too tightly though. They're not meant to squeeze so hard that you pulverize or crush the glass. You're just using them to grip. And that's what the flat jaw is for, to grip right along the edge of the score line and then to snap backward. When you're using the pliers and you happen to get a really choppy edge, it's okay. Mosaics can tolerate having a little bit more of a choppy edge, so not to worry. Always make sure you're scraping off your area before you start cutting more pieces. Now when you're done with a particular color, you can start laying them out on your second pattern. That way you can sort of see what your glass is going to look like when it's all finished. Now I'm cutting the black pieces. I put them on with rubber cement just so that you could see a little bit more clearly for this demonstration how I'm cutting. I cut sort of shallow first and then break with pliers. Oh, didn't quite break where I wanted it to. It's okay, just reposition your hand and your pliers and snap it back. I'm going to make one more cut that's going to go in just a little bit more into that curve. I have a specific strategy that I like to employ, which just sort of avoids where those points touch the edge. But with practice, you can learn to cut this way as well. But for right now, just cut it a little bit of that curve at a time and break it with pliers. If the piece snaps in half or it breaks funny, go ahead and use it. There's no need for a mosaic for it to end up being one piece and one piece only. If it breaks into three pieces, that's okay. I just happen to be cutting this piece, and as you can see, it's getting a little choppy. That's okay too. Remember, it's a mosaic. It's okay to have a choppy edge. So I'm just chipping away right where that score line is, just to remove any of that extra glass there. Here's the choppy edge. It's all right. It's going to be totally fine. Now I'm just cutting away any of those little extra parts that I needed to, and my thumb is right there on the other side of the score line, chipping it away. I just want to support that piece and hold on to it as close as I can. So I'm going to get that little part right there. This is a little tricky because you got to get your score line right up against the glass piece, but again, my thumb's right there, pliers on the other side, and I'm just chipping it away. Not trying to make the glass turn into powder, but sometimes it will. So you got to scrape your cutting board so that you have an area to work with. Now I'm going to try this curve right here. So I'm just going from edge to edge, again putting my thumb right there against the score line and then snapping it with my pliers. That's another curve that you probably want to try and attempt first. So now I'm going to be separating both of these pieces into their own little islands, but I'm going to start with the outside edge of this trunk piece here. So I just kind of glide the cutter all the way to the other edge of the glass. There's a couple of little skip lines there, but it doesn't matter so much. When you tap the back side, make sure that you keep it pretty close to the cutting board because you don't want it to fall really far. Now I'm going to cut right straight across like this. You can break it either with your hands or with pliers. Pliers is a little bit easier. There's a little left over. Now score from one edge to the other, go right along the pattern piece, and then use the flat jaw on top, snap it in half. I'm going to be cutting a little bit of that extra off and using the pliers to grip and just kind of chew the extra glass off. Be very careful when you do that because you're not trying to chew off too much. It's a little jagged, and that's okay because it's a mosaic. Now I'm cutting the rest of those edges. The little bits of those edges. Pliers, again, are the way better choice when you're trying to break off pieces from these smaller pieces like this. So one little bit at a time. I put my thumb right there and then the pliers on the other side and snap it off. You always want to support the glass with your other hand, the hand that doesn't have the pliers in them, just because the force from the pliers tends to be a little much, so you want to hold on to the glass as much as you can. So then grip and then snap it backward. Again, I'm holding on really tightly on the other side of the score line. And then again, I'm chewing a little bit. You can try and get your cutter in there to get the little bits off right in here, and then use the pliers to just grip and snap. And then you can leave that if you want to, or you can attempt to chew it off just a little bit. That's when you're kind of using the jaws of the pliers to just, literally chew a little bit of the glass off. Now it's going to be these sky pieces. These sky pieces are a little bit more challenging because these are the ones that have the toughest curves in them. These are inside curves. So those are going to be cut first after I've separated these into islands. So I'm going through and I'm cutting them down so that they're separate pieces, just breaking with my hands. You're going to notice that this opalescent glass here, this glass that's translucent, has a little bit of white in it, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to break because it's got white in it. So it's a little bit more dense. So pieces like this is going to be a little bit trickier. If they don't end up in one piece, don't worry about it. You don't have to recut, but they are definitely denser, these pieces here. So you're going to want to use the pliers as much as you can. Do not tap this glass. So all of these pieces here have these little curves that I've placed right on the corners. And that's the way I place them so that it would be easier to cut. I'm going to go sort of along the inside of the Sharpie line, and then again, grip and snap. I'm gripping with one hand, and then I've got my pliers in the other hand. So for this, I'm going to go just sort of right across, hitting that one point and then going to the other point first. Then I'll catch those little curves in just a sec. So right now, I hit this first curve and chomp it off. Then this one's a little trickier. If we were in class, we would use the grinder and we would kind of shape that up a little bit. But in this case, you can give it a try, but it's a very tight curve, so sometimes it's a little trickier. This may be a piece that may not turn out so well. Don't worry so much about it. I'm just using the pliers to kind of, again, chew a little bit of that off. You can give that a try, but if it's a little bit tricky and it's not working for you, then don't worry about it. Just go with what you've got. So here I'm making these score lines, and again, just using the pliers for most of them. This kind of a size of a piece, don't hit it on the back side, because tapping really works when the pieces are bigger, because there's a vibration that occurs on the glass, through the glass, and that just doesn't really happen when you're using these smaller pieces like this. So you can take these cuts a little bit at a time. You don't have to cut it all in one go. You can cut parts of each of these edges and then just use your pliers to just gradually break bits away. This is a little bit trickier now because now we're getting into smaller pieces. All of these pieces that are on the top of the tree, those have a bunch of curves on them. So I've placed them so that I can now go from one edge of the glass to the other edge of the glass and separate them into their own little islands. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm just separating them all and then tapping the back side. That works for a piece about this size. Tapping the back is okay, but any smaller than that, not so much. So now you can take these curves a little bit at a time. I call them they're just like tangent lines, just like in math around a circle where you have a line that hits one point. Ours aren't quite tangent lines, but it's the same concept. You have sort of a straight line, and a series of them going around will get these to be curved shapes. And then you're just breaking these pieces all around. So I'm holding on and just chomping off. If you miss any spots, just put a score line there and grip and snap. So now I'm going to speed it up just slightly so that you can see more of this in motion. So now you're just going to watch this happen. And if you want to speed up the video a little bit more, that's totally up to you. The editing software that I was using only speeds it up twice as fast. I want you to notice the technique that I'm using here. You may think that I'm just drawing a score line around the entire piece, but I'm really not. I'm doing a score line at a time, but in a certain order, and then I'm going around and I'm chomping off. So I'm scoring edge to edge, and then breaking it, breaking it, breaking it, breaking it, breaking it. Same thing, kind of going along, and I'm going from edge to edge on all of this, just connecting the score lines, then breaking them off in a sequence. I'll draw a little diagram here in a minute. But I break them off in the order that I cut them, all around. So edge to edge, breaking it off, 2 pliers, then I go that one, and that one, and that one, and that one. Here it is. So if that's my piece, I'll cut that one first, but then watch where I'm connecting the score lines and taking the score lines off to the edge. Score line to an edge, score line to score line, and then this is the sequence that I break them all off. This is the quick way. So that's exactly what I'm doing here, just gripping with a pair of pliers on either side if it's a really narrow little spot, and then just chomping off in the same order that I did the score lines. And I just chew off some of where the Sharpie is. So this opalescent glass, again, is a little bit tougher. It's more dense. So I'm separating them into their own little islands. I'm repeating all of this, showing you how to cut all of these pieces, because I want you to see just how I do it. I'm not leaving anything out. I'm just cutting and breaking, most of the time with the pliers. Occasionally I tap the glass, but not on these kinds of cuts. These definitely need to have pliers to grip and then to snap off bits. Aim for the inside of the Sharpie line, always. So we're near the end here, and I'm just cutting this number 14, breaking it all off, just like I did before, kind of chewing off a little bit of the Sharpie. Then, as luck would have it, I dropped it on the floor. So I just used the extra glass, retraced just the same way with the horizon, on the smooth side, of course. And I'm going to try and cut this so that I have a little bit of glass left over. So again, I just attempt to make the cuts. If you have to cut a couple of these pieces several times, that's not uncommon, especially when you start to get to the tougher glass like the opalescence. Before you start setting all of your mosaic pieces that have been cut onto the white board, you might want to trace the pattern onto that whiteboard, but don't number it. Just place the carbon paper right on the whiteboard. Remember the letter side up. Then you're just tracing, because if you used any cathedral glass, any numbers will show right through. So start placing those pieces just the way they go, following the very faint line that's on that whiteboard. You can't see it here because it is very, very faint. But you're positioning everything the way it's supposed to go. And remember, this is going to be a little rough because you're doing this with no grinders. So there should be a little bit of space in between each one of those pieces. As well, there should be a space all around the outside edge. That's totally fine. Everything should look sort of like this. If some of those pieces split in half or into a couple of pieces, it's up to you whether or not you want to recut them. Now you're going to be using some alcohol, or you could use hand sanitizer or nail polish remover on a paper towel and just one at a time remove the numbers. So be very, very careful not to move this mosaic around, because without the numbers, now you're just going by where the pieces are and by the shapes of them. So if something happens where the pieces scatter, it may be a whole lot more difficult to try and figure out where they go. Not impossible, but a little more difficult. Once you have your Sharpie all removed, then you can start gluing. One at a time, you can apply glue to the back side of each piece and then place them down. I would definitely, especially on the see-through glass, I would apply the glue and then use your finger to spread it around like it's cake icing on a cracker. Kind of a weird analogy, but that's what I'm talking about. So you're spreading the glue evenly so that it has good coverage and it's secure. You'll let the glue dry for one day and then you can proceed to grout.